Right now, another hearing is underway to determine whether the government can deport Palestinian activist and green card holder Mahmoud Khalil. His lawyers want Secretary of State Marco Rubio to testify. In a memo, he did not accuse Khalil of committing any crimes, but wrote that his mere presence in the U.S. undermines foreign policy. Joining us now, NBC's Yasmin Basugian and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Yasmin, what's the latest from court?
We don't know much. We're 11 minutes into this hearing so far. There was no technology allowed in the courtroom, no cameras either. So we're going to be getting notes somewhat delayed when it comes to what's happening inside the courtroom. But this is an evidentiary hearing. So what that means is the burden of proof obviously is on the government here. They have to present the evidence as to why they believe Mahmoud Khalil is actually deportable. And the judge has said she will decide today if in fact he is deportable or if he's not deportable, if the evidence is in fact there. It says immigration court in Louisiana. The only evidence, Chris, presented by the government so far is a 2-page letter from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. This is the evidence by the government, which I know Lisa's going to get into a little bit more, but I just want to read for you a little bit from this letter, because I think it's important about the case, quote unquote, that they're building here, based upon, of course, Section 237, which we had talked about, right, that he is a disservice, for instance, to foreign policy. And they go on to say, it's the alien's past, current, or expected beliefs, statements, or associations that are otherwise lawful. The Secretary of State must personally determine that the alien's presence or activities would compromise a compelling U.S. foreign policy interest. So in this letter, they say actually his actions are lawful. So then it is incumbent upon the Secretary of State to determine that he should not remain here in the United States. Going on to say, regarding the participation in rules of Khalil in anti-Semitic protests and disruptive activities, which fosters a hostile environment for Jewish students in the United States. Of course, his attorneys, who I spoke to yesterday, are planning to argue that, in fact, he was a pro-Palestinian protester, working as lead negotiator for these protests last year between the protesters and the administration at Columbia University. Of course, those protesters wanting Columbia University to divest from companies that were profiting from the Israel-Gaza war. So certainly this hearing is going to be ongoing today, but we could get a decision one way or the other if she believes he is deportable or not. And then, of course, there's going to be the appeals.
Well, let me ask you first, Lisa, what are the chances that Marco Rubio is compelled to testify?
I don't think that they're particularly high, at least today, and I would be very, very surprised if Secretary Rubio is in the courtroom. However, under the statute, as Yasmin alluded to, this is a portion of the Immigration and Nationality Act that leaves to the Secretary of State in his own personal capacity to make a reasonable determination that he has grounds to believe that an alien or an undocumented immigrant's presence in the United States poses potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. And then there's the language that Yasmin cited. Even to the extent that the person has not committed any crime, you cannot deport them on the basis of their past, current, or even expected belief statements or associations unless the Secretary of State makes a personal determination that there is a compelling foreign policy reason to deport that person. To the extent,
does he have to justify that?
Well, he's supposed to justify that. And to the extent that there's case law on this, this is a very little invoked provision, as you might imagine. To the extent that there's some case law, there is a Board of Immigration Appeals decision from the Clinton era that involves someone who is a Mexican national that Warren Christopher, who was then the Secretary of State, determined had to be deported because that person was subject to an indictment in Mexico. They had been an office holder in Mexico, and he thought that his continued presence in the U.S. actually did compromise U.S.-Mexican relations vis-a-vis certain programs that the U.S. was trying to build at the time with Mexico. Here, one of the things that's missing on the face of this document, regardless of its length, is any foreign policy justification. It talks about anti-Semitism on United States college campuses. I was a Jewish student on a United States college campus. I don't mean to undermine the concern, but it is not a foreign policy concern. It is a domestic concern with respect to the safety and security of students on U.S. college campuses that is animating this memo, not anything having to do with U.S.-Israeli relations or U.S. relations with anybody else.
And obviously, Khalil's future is at stake, but how important is this decision in terms of other detained green card holders? And I guess some people would argue the future of how immigration law is looked at.
I think it's an important decision, not because it has precedential effect per se, because it won't, but it is an important decision to the extent that the administration is relying on this little used provision to get student activists out of the country.
Like a test case.
Yes, and By the way, this memo isn't just about Mahmoud Khalil. There are redactions in the memo that Yasmin is holding because there is another student activist whose alleged danger to the United States is being outlined in here.